The cold was a thief, and it had stolen everything from Ilara but one last thing. It stole the feeling from her fingers, the warmth from her breath, and the hope from her heart, but it could not pry the silver locket from her grasp. Inside, the faded likeness of her mother was a ghost of a memory, a sacred whisper against the screaming emptiness in her soul. To sell it would be to sell the last piece of herself, a final betrayal of the woman who gave her life. Yet, the hunger was a more immediate tyrant, a gnawing beast that promised a slower, more agonizing death. This single, cold piece of silver was the only thing standing between her and utter oblivion. As Ilara's story begins in this forgotten corner of the world, let us know in the comments your name, where you are watching from, and the time it is for you. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Her world was Dusthaven, a city built from grit and despair, perpetually choked by the grey haze of coal smoke and forgotten sorrows. The skeletal remains of grander buildings clawed at the sky, their broken windows like vacant eyes staring into nothingness. Here, survival was a relentless, grinding chore. Ilara moved through the grimy streets like a phantom, her threadbare cloak doing little to ward off the biting wind that whipped through the alleyways. She was invisible, just another hungry face in a crowd of hollowed-out people, her presence as fleeting as the steam from her own breath. She yearned for more than just a crust of bread or a warm fire. She harbored a secret, shameful desire to be seen, to be acknowledged as more than just a shadow clinging to the edges of existence in a city that had already pronounced her dead. The locket was more than silver. It was the anchor of her identity. Its smooth, worn surface was a familiar comfort against her skin, a tangible link to a past she could only piece together from fragmented dreams. She would trace the delicate engravings with a numb finger, imagining her mother's hands, the sound of her voice, the warmth of her embrace. The woman in the portrait was a stranger, yet Ilara knew her face better than her own. This object was her proof of lineage, her evidence that she had been born of love, not just abandoned to the cruelty of the world. The thought of trading this sacred relic for a few coins felt like a desecration, a sacrilege that would sever her from her own history, leaving her utterly and irrevocably alone in the vast, uncaring universe. The weight of this choice was a physical burden, pressing down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. The breaking point arrived, not with a crash, but with a quiet, terrifying stillness. The gnawing ache in her stomach had sharpened into a blinding pain, and a wave of dizziness washed over her, making the grimy walls of her small room swim. The last of her stale bread was gone. The final embers in her hearth had long since turned to ash, and the cold had finally seeped past her skin and into her very bones. It was a cold that promised to stop her heart. In that moment, the fight went out of her. A chilling resolve, as sharp and clear as ice, settled over her despair. Survival was a primal instinct, and it had finally overpowered memory, love, and guilt. She would do it. She would walk to the market square, to the pawnbroker's shop with its sign like a gallows, and she would trade her soul for another day of life. With the locket clutched so tightly in her palm that its edges dug into her skin, Ilara stepped out into the biting wind. The chaotic symphony of the Dusthaven market, the haggling shouts, the cry of a distant child, the clatter of carts on cobblestone, was a muted roar in her ears. Her entire world had narrowed to the single, terrifying purpose of her journey. She saw the pawnbroker's faded sign ahead, a grim sentinel guarding a repository of broken dreams and last resorts. Each step was a final, painful farewell to her mother, to her past, to the girl she had been. Her hand trembled, not from the cold, but from the magnitude of her sacrifice. As she reached for the shop's heavy iron handle, the world seemed to hold its breath, unaware that this one desperate act act of a starving girl was about to tear a hole in the veil between worlds, drawing the unwavering gaze of a king from his shadowed throne. The warmth of the cloak was a shock, a sudden suffocating heat that felt more like a brand than a comfort. It smelled of pine needles after a frost, of ancient stone, and a faint, sharp scent like ozone before a storm, the scent of magic. Ilara froze, her entire being consumed by the impossible contrast between the threadbare rags she wore and the opulent weight of the ermine fur settling on her shoulders. The market square, once a cacophony of desperate commerce, had fallen into a dead, reverent silence. Every eye was on her, on the towering, silver-haired figure whose hand now rested on her shoulder, a grip that was not gentle or reassuring, but absolute. It was a claim. In that single, silent gesture, she had been transformed from an anonymous speck of dust into a spectacle, an object of intense, terrifying scrutiny. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her own body. Her past was a tapestry woven from threads of absence. She had no memory of a mother's lullaby or a father's hand, only the cold stone steps of the Dusthaven workhouse and the thin, scratchy blanket she was found in. The silver locket was her only inheritance, a cold piece of metal that the matrons had tried to take from her countless times. It was her genesis and her curse. For clinging to it, she was branded as a dreamer, a fool holding on to a fantasy. The other orphans, hardened by a world that had discarded them, saw her quiet devotion to the locket as a weakness. They mocked her for it, calling her the ghost child, forever haunted by a mother who had thrown her away like trash. This constant, casual cruelty carved her primary wound deep into her soul, the unshakable belief that she was born of rejection, a life begun as an unwanted secret. This wound festered in the darkness of her lonely childhood, poisoning any chance of connection. She remembered once, during a particularly harsh winter, sharing her meager ration of bread with a younger boy, a newcomer with eyes as haunted as her own. For a week, they were inseparable, a tiny alliance against the world's indifference. Then, one morning, he was gone, chosen by a passing merchant for an apprenticeship. He hadn't even said goodbye. The empty space he left beside her on the cold floor was a chasm, and the silence was louder than any of the matron's shouts. That was the day Ilara learned the true cost of hope. It was a fool's currency, and she was bankrupt. From then on, she walled off her heart with stones of silence and suspicion, convinced that solitude was the only shield against the inevitable pain of being left behind. Because of this, romance was a concept as foreign and fantastical to her as the tales of fey magic whispered by old women. In the grimy, desperate alleys of Dusthaven, love was a transaction, a fleeting warmth traded for a meal or a roof for the night, and it often soured into resentment and bruises. She saw it in the weary eyes of women tied to cruel men, and in the bitter words exchanged over empty cookpots. To her, affection was a dangerous vulnerability, an invitation for someone to see the hollow spaces inside her and either exploit them or flee from them. She could not imagine anyone looking at her calloused hands, her gaunt face, her soul shrouded in dust, and seeing anything worth wanting. To dream of being cherished was to invite a unique and devastating kind of agony, a fall from a height she had never even dared to climb. Back in the suffocating present, the Elf King's guards moved with a silent, fluid grace that was utterly inhuman. They emerged from the crowd as if they had been there all along, their silver armor gleaming even in the dim, smog-filtered light. They formed a perfect, impenetrable circle around Ilara and their king, their stoic faces and pointed ears marking them as beings from another world. The people of Dusthaven, who feared even the mention of the Fae, recoiled as if struck, their earlier curiosity curdling into primal fear. Ilara felt a tremor of that same fear, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the winter air. She was trapped. The king had still not spoken, but his silver eyes, ancient and unreadable, were fixed on her, stripping away her defenses, seeing every scar, every fear, every pathetic hope she had ever harbored. He saw her, and she had never felt more terrifyingly exposed. He began to walk, his hand moving from her shoulder to her arm, his grip firm, guiding her as one might lead a prized but untamed animal. She stumbled after him, her worn-out boots struggling to find purchase on the uneven cobblestones. The crowd parted before them like water, a sea of awestruck, terrified faces. At the edge of the market, a carriage waited. It was a thing of impossible beauty, carved from a wood that shimmered like mother of pearl and drawn by two horses the color of midnight, their eyes glowing with a faint, internal light. It did not belong in this world of grime and decay. One of the guards opened the door, and the king propelled her inside without a word of explanation. The plush velvet interior was another sensory shock. A world away from the splintered benches and cold floors she had always known. She was a stray dog in a palace, completely lost. The carriage door closed with a soft, final click, sealing her inside with the silent, formidable king. It moved without a jolt, gliding through the streets of Dusthaven with a supernatural smoothness. Ilara stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape of her suffering blur and recede. The oppressive grey sky, the skeletal buildings, the faces of the hungry, it all faded away, replaced by something new and terrifying. The carriage passed through a shimmering curtain of mist that Ilara had never seen before, and on the other side, the world was transformed. Ancient trees, with silver bark and leaves of emerald and gold, towered over them, their branches forming a canopy that blotted out the sun. She was no longer in the world of men. She had crossed into a legend, a prisoner being taken deep into the heart of Silverwood, the mythical elven kingdom, with no idea if she was meant to be a guest, a sacrifice, or a queen. In the heart of Silverwood, within a throne room carved from living, silver-barked trees, King Theron sat not upon his throne, but stood before a vast crystalline window overlooking his silent kingdom. He was a figure forged from moonlight and frost, with hair like spun silver that fell over the sharp, elegant lines of his shoulders. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held the ancient weary wisdom of 1,000 years, yet they were shadowed by a deep, unsettling grief. His physical presence was one of absolute, unquestionable authority. Every line of his body, from his tall, lean frame to the deliberate stillness of his hands, radiated a power that was both innate and crushing. He wore his crown of woven starlight and thorns not as an adornment, but as a penance, its weight a constant reminder of the burden he alone carried for his people. The pressures on his reign were relentless, a constant siege from within his own court. The noble houses of Silverwood, with their ancient lineages and suffocating pride, were a nest of vipers whispering in the shadows. They saw his desperation as weakness, his attempts to find a solution to their plight as a fool's errand. Lord Valerius of the Obsidian Spire was his most vocal critic, a formidable elf, with eyes like chips of flint, who believed that any alliance with the mortal world, especially with humans, was a sacrilege that would poison their sacred bloodline forever. Theron was forced to navigate a treacherous political landscape, where every decision was scrutinized, every vulnerability exploited. He was surrounded by allies whose loyalty was conditional and rivals who waited eagerly for him to fail, ready to seize power from the ashes of his kingdom. This internal strife was fueled by a far more insidious threat, the Withering. It was a slow, creeping plague upon their magic, a silence that had fallen over the land. The ancient trees no longer sang to the wind, the mystical streams ran sluggish and dull, and the very air, once crackling with power, grew thin and listless. For the elves, whose lives were intrinsically woven with the magic of their home, it was a death sentence delivered over centuries. Their immortality was becoming a curse, forcing them to watch their world fade into a grey, powerless echo of its former glory. Theron felt it in his own veins, a faint but persistent chill, a weakening of the power that defined his very being. The horror was not in a swift end, but in this slow, inexorable decay, a quiet extinction no one knew how to stop. Behind the stoic mask of the unassailable king was a man drowning in solitude. The secret of the withering's true extent was a burden he bore alone. To reveal the full depth of their decline would be to invite chaos, to give his rivals the very weapon they needed to incite a civil war. And so he stood apart, isolated by his crown and his knowledge. In the dead of night, when the last of his court had retired, the facade would crumble, revealing a profound and terrifying vulnerability. He was the guardian of a dying legacy, the king of a silent forest, haunted by the faces of his people whose futures rested entirely on his shoulders. This hidden terror was his most intimate companion, a cold fear that he would be the last king of the elves, the one who presided over their final, fading breath. His desperate search through ancient lore and forgotten prophecies had yielded a single, terrifying hope. An ancient pact, forged before the Great War, spoke of a human bloodline infused with a dormant, primal magic, a magic of life and renewal that the Fae had lost. This bloodline held the key to reawakening their own fading power, a catalyst to reverse the withering. The silver locket, an artifact of that long-lost lineage, was the sign he had been searching for. Finding Ilara was not an act of mercy. It was the final, desperate gambit of a king with no other moves to make. She was not a woman to him, not yet. She was a relic, a vessel, a potential cure for his dying world. And he had claimed her with the cold, calculated precision of a master strategist securing his most vital asset. Ilara, meanwhile, had been escorted to a chamber of breathtaking beauty and chilling silence. The walls were spun from what looked like pearlescent glass, and the bed was draped in silks the color of twilight. It was a cage, however gilded. She had not eaten, had not spoken to anyone since being thrust into the carriage. Hours passed in a state of suspended terror, her mind replaying the moment in the market, the weight of the cloak, the king's unreadable eyes. She was a stray animal brought into a pristine palace, certain she had already soiled it with her mere presence. Just as the shadows grew long, the heavy door opened. A guard, his face a mask of stoic indifference, stood in the doorway. "The king requires your presence," he stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. Immediately. A cold dread washed over Ilara. The summons felt like a death sentence. She was sure she was being called to answer for a crime she didn't even know she had committed. She was led not to the grand throne room she had half expected, but to a private study that felt older than the mountains. The air was thick with the scent of dried herbs, ancient parchment, and the crisp, clean fragrance of winter frost that seemed to cling to the king himself. Towering shelves carved from the same silver-barked wood as the walls were crammed with leather-bound tomes and celestial charts. A fire crackled in a hearth of polished obsidian, but its warmth did not reach the center of the room where she stood, a small, shivering creature in a vast, silent world. King Theron stood with his back to her, gazing out a window that overlooked a moonlit garden of crystalline flowers. His stillness was absolute, a predator's patience that stretched the silence until it was a physical weight on Ilara's shoulders, pressing the air from her lungs and making her heart pound a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. Finally, he turned. The movement was fluid and deliberate, devoid of any wasted motion. His silver eyes met hers, and Ilara felt the full, crushing force of his presence. It was not a gaze of anger or pity, but of cold, dispassionate assessment. Like a master craftsman examining a tool to determine its utility, he held her silver locket in his long, elegant fingers, its familiar weight looking alien and fragile in his grasp. He did not speak, allowing the silence to unnerve her further. Stripping away the thin layers of her defiance, she forced herself to stand straight, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the knuckles white. She had faced down starving men in the alleys of Dusthaven for a crust of bread. She would not crumble before a king, no matter how powerful. Yet a tremor ran through her, a betrayal by her own body, which understood the danger far better than her pride did. "My kingdom is dying," he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur that seemed to fill the vast space, as cool and clear as the air outside. "It is a quiet death, a slow fading of the magic that is our lifeblood. The trees no longer sing, the rivers run silent. We call it the withering." He walked slowly towards her, his eyes never leaving her face, his expression unreadable. "For centuries, my people have watched our world turn to grey. We, who are meant to be immortal, are cursed to witness our own extinction in excruciating detail. My council bickers over trivialities. My nobles plot for a crown that will soon be little more than a memorial wreath. I have been tasked with finding a cure for a plague that has no name and a wound that will not bleed." He paused before her, so close she could feel a chill emanating from him, the cold of ancient sorrow. He gestured with the locket. "This was not your mother's. It belonged to her ancestor, a woman of your world who made a pact with my own, long before the wars that divided us. Her bloodline was infused with a gift, a spark of the old magic, the wild, untamed magic of creation that my people have long since lost. It is a magic of life, of renewal, a magic that has slept dormant in your veins your entire life." The words struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow, shattering the miserable, simple reality she had always known. She was not just an orphan, a piece of human refuse. She was something else, a legacy, a key. The revelation did not feel like a gift. It felt like a brand, marking her as a strange and valuable commodity, a thing to be coveted not for who she was, but for what she contained. "I have searched for that key for a century," Theron continued, his voice dropping to an intense, almost hypnotic whisper. "And now I have found it in a Dusthaven gutter. The prophecies are clear. The pact must be renewed. Your bloodline must be rejoined with mine." He stopped directly in front of her, the sheer difference in their heights forcing her to crane her neck to meet his gaze. "I am offering you a bargain, girl, a marriage. You will become my wife, my queen, and you will sit beside me on the throne of Silverwood. You will be the vessel through which the magic of your ancestors is reintroduced to my people, saving them from the silence that awaits." The proposal was so monstrous, so utterly insane, that for a moment Ilara could only stare at him, convinced she was in the throes of a starvation-induced fever dream. He saw the disbelief and fear warring in her eyes and pressed his advantage with calculated cruelty. "Consider the alternative, a return to your hovel, to the gnawing hunger and the endless, biting cold. A life of invisibility, ending in a shallow, unmarked grave. I offer you a world you cannot even imagine. Gowns of starlight silk, feasts that never end, the warmth of a fire that will never die. You will have status, power, and protection. You will never be hungry or cold or afraid again. All I ask in return is your vow, your presence, and the child that will carry the future of my race in its veins." He laid the terms out like a death sentence wrapped in velvet, a gilded cage offered to a starving bird. It was a choice between a slow, miserable death and a life that was not her own, a complete surrender of her body and soul. A storm of emotions raged within Ilara. There was the primal terror of this powerful, inhuman being and his impossible demands. There was the dizzying shock of learning her life was a lie, built on a foundation of forgotten magic. But beneath it all, a small, hard kernel of anger began to form. He spoke of her as a vessel, a cure, a broodmare. He had not asked her name. He had not offered a hand in kindness. Only a contract sealed by desperation, his and hers. She looked at his perfect, cold face, at the crown of thorns and starlight, and saw not a savior but another master, more powerful than any she had known before. And yet survival was a lesson etched into her very bones. To refuse was to die. To accept was to live, however hollow that life might be. The choice was no choice at all. Her voice, when it finally came, was raspy from disuse, but held a sliver of steel that made the Elf King's silver eyes narrow almost imperceptibly. "I accept your proposal," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He gave a slight, satisfied nod, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. But she was not finished. She took a breath, anchoring herself in the one piece of her identity that had not been stripped away, her will to endure. "But I have one condition." She lifted her chin, meeting his powerful gaze without flinching. "You will swear an oath, bound by the very magic you seek from me. You will swear that you will never treat me as a possession, but as your queen, and you will return my mother's locket. It is mine, and it will remain with me always." The silence that followed was charged, the quiet hum of a blade being drawn from its sheath. For a long moment, the king was utterly still, his silver eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt as though it could strip the flesh from her bones. The audacity of her demand, a condition placed upon a monarch by a gutter dweller, hung in the air like a razor's edge. He had expected fear, gratitude, or perhaps a desperate, fumbling acceptance. He had not expected defiance. A slow, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his expression, a flicker of something ancient and unreadable that might have been respect. With a deliberate, fluid motion, he extended his hand palm up. He did not drop the locket into her waiting grasp. Instead, he uncurled her clenched fist with his own cool fingers and placed the silver heirloom gently into her palm, his touch lingering for a fraction of a second too long. "The oath is sworn," Theron said, his voice a low vibration that resonated in her chest. "You are Ilara, Queen of Silverwood, and you will not be a possession." The ceremony was not held in a grand hall filled with courtiers, but in a place far older and more sacred, the Heart Grove, a silent cathedral of ancient silverwood trees whose branches intertwined to form a living ceiling. The air was cool and still, thick with the scent of damp earth and a faint electric hum of dormant magic. Ilara was dressed in a gown of deep midnight silk that felt impossibly soft against her skin, a stark contrast to the coarse woolen linen she had known her entire life. She felt like a doll, an impostor draped in borrowed finery, standing before a heartwood altar that pulsed with a faint, internal light. Theron stood beside her, not in his armor or regal finery, but in simple, dark tunics that made him seem less like a king and more like a primal force of nature, a spirit of the ancient, silent forest itself. Only one witness was present, a stern, sharp-featured elf with eyes like obsidian chips and a palpable aura of disdain, Lord Valerius. He stood a respectful distance away, his posture rigid, his face a perfect mask of aristocratic contempt. Every line of his body screamed his disapproval of this sacrilegious union. He saw her not as a queen, but as a human contamination, a filthy tool their desperate king was using to pollute their sacred bloodline. Ilara could feel the weight of his hatred, like a physical pressure on her back, a cold promise of the political war that awaited her beyond this grove. She was not just marrying a king, she was stepping onto a battlefield, and this powerful, resentful noble was her first and most dangerous enemy, a viper waiting for the perfect moment to strike. There were no priests, only the ancient law of the Fae. Theron's vows were not whispers of love, but a declaration of purpose, his voice echoing with grim finality in the sacred silence. I, Theron, King of Silverwood, take you, Elara of the human realm, to be my wife and my queen. I bind you to my side, to my throne, and to my people. Through you, the pact of our ancestors will be renewed. Through you, the withering will be undone. He turned to her, and his silver eyes held a chilling resolve. It was her turn. Her own voice was a fragile tremor in the vast quiet. I, Elara, she began, her throat tight, take you, Theron, to be my husband and my king. I accept this pact, your protection and your name, to fulfill the debt of my bloodline. The words were ash in her mouth, the cold, hard currency of her own survival. The binding was not done with rings of metal, but with magic itself. Theron took her right hand in his grip firm and cool. With his other hand, he unsheathed a small, ornate dagger, and without hesitation, drew a thin, clean line across his own palm. A single drop of silver, shimmering blood welled up. Before she could react, he pressed his bleeding palm against hers. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up Elara's arm, a gasp escaping her lips. It was not a sensation of pain, but of connection, a sudden, overwhelming torrent of ancient sorrow, crushing responsibility, and a profound loneliness that was not her own. It was his. For a breathtaking moment, she felt the full weight of his crown, the silent despair of his dying kingdom, and the cold, unyielding burden he carried alone. The final act of the binding was a kiss. It was meant to be a seal, a formality to finalize the magical contract. He lowered his head, his silver hair brushing against her cheek, and his lips met hers. The initial contact was cool, like touching frosted marble, a confirmation of the cold bargain they had struck. But then something shifted. A deep, unexpected warmth bloomed from the point of contact, a slow burning fire that seemed to melt the ice in her veins. It was not a kiss of passion, but of possession, a silent, unequivocal claim that went far beyond their spoken vows. It stole the air from her lungs and sent a dizzying tremor through her entire body, awakening a strange, forgotten ache deep within her soul. It was the touch of a man who had been starved for 1,000 years. When he pulled away, the king's composure was, for the first time, fractured. His silver eyes were wide, a storm of disbelief and something darker, something akin to hunger, raging within their depths. His breath was unsteady, a slight tremor in his otherwise perfect stillness. He looked at her not as a political tool or a magical cure, but as the source of a fire he had forgotten could exist. He had initiated the kiss as a monarch sealing a pact, but he had been met with a resonance, a spark of life from her dormant magic that had answered his own in a way he had never anticipated. The shock of it left him visibly unsettled, stripping away the mask of the unassailable king and revealing a flicker of the vulnerable man beneath. He was not in control of this bargain. He had just lit a fuse without knowing where it led. The walk back to the palace was conducted in a silence more profound and charged than any they had shared before. Lord Valerius trailed behind them, his presence a cold shadow, but Elara was only aware of Theron beside her. They did not touch, yet the space between them crackled with an invisible energy, a tension so thick it felt as if the very air had solidified. Her lips still tingled with the memory of his, and her hand felt branded where his blood had met her skin. She could still feel the echo of his loneliness, a phantom ache in her own heart. She had entered the grove a starving orphan making a deal for her life. She left it as a queen bound by magic to a formidable, enigmatic king whose unexpected response to her had just made their arrangement infinitely more complicated and dangerous. They did not speak as they were escorted through the silent, crystalline halls to the royal wing. Guards bowed their heads as they passed, their faces impassive, but Ilara felt their curious stares. She was the human queen, the strange creature from a dying world, brought here as a last resort. The heavy, carved doors to the king's chambers were opened, and she was ushered inside. The room was vast and beautiful, with a balcony overlooking the moon-drenched forest, but it felt like the most opulent prison cell she had ever seen. The reality of her situation crashed down upon her. This was their chamber. This was her wedding night. She stood frozen in the center of the room, her body rigid with a mixture of terror and a strange, humming anticipation, waiting for the king to claim the final part of his bargain. Theron entered behind her, and the great doors closed with a soft, final thud that sealed them in together. The sound echoed the frantic beating of her heart. Ilara braced herself, expecting him to approach her with the cold, regal purpose of a king fulfilling a duty. Instead, he walked past her to the vast window, his back to her as he stared out at the silent, silvered landscape. The silence stretched, each second a new torment. When he finally spoke, his voice was not that of a monarch, but of a man burdened by an ancient weariness. "The stars are not as bright as they were a century ago," he murmured, his tone laced with a profound sadness that caught her completely off guard. He then turned, and his gaze was intense, not on her as a vessel, but as a woman. "I did not," he began, his voice low and raw, his eyes lingering on her mouth, "anticipate this." His words hung in the air between them, a confession of a weakness he had never intended to show. Ilara stared at him, her own shock mirroring his. The vast, opulent chamber, which had felt like a gilded cage moments before, now seemed to shrink, charged with a tension that was no longer just fear, but something far more complex and terrifying. It was a current of awareness, a sudden, sharp recognition of the man behind the crown and the woman behind the rags. She saw the flicker of vulnerability in his ancient silver eyes, a crack in the icy facade that revealed a profound, centuries-old loneliness. He had anticipated a political tool, a magical catalyst, a duty to be performed. He had not anticipated a connection that felt like lightning striking a dead tree, forcing it to remember what it was to be alive. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the deafening sound of two worlds colliding within the confines of a single room. The next morning, Ilara awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight filtering through crystalline windows, painting rainbows on the silk sheets. The other side of the vast bed was empty, the sheets cool and undisturbed, as if he had never been there at all. A quiet pang of something she refused to name, disappointment, pricked at her. Elven servants, silent and graceful as deer, entered to assist her, their movements fluid and their faces impassive. They dressed her in a gown the color of a winter sky and braided silver threads into her hair, their touch respectful but distant. She was a queen, yet she felt like a ghost haunting her own life, a curiosity to be tended to, but never truly seen. Every polite nod and averted gaze from the staff was a fresh reminder of her otherness, a silent judgment that she was a human weed transplanted into a pristine, magical garden where she did not belong. Days bled into a strange routine. Theron would summon her to the royal library, a cavernous space that smelled of ancient wood and starlight, for lessons on elven history and court etiquette. These sessions were stiff and formal, a king instructing his consort on her duties. Yet, in the quiet moments between reciting genealogies and memorizing political alliances, something else would flicker to life. Once, while describing a particularly pompous ancestor, a dry, witty observation slipped from Ilara's lips, born of her Dusthaven cynicism. The unexpected humor made Theron pause, a ghost of a smile touching his lips before he quickly suppressed it. These fleeting moments of genuine interaction were like sparks in the dark, brief and startling, hinting at a chemistry that defied their cold, calculated arrangement and left them both unsettled and hungry for more. Her official presentation to the Elven High Council was a trial by ice. She walked into the Hall of Echoes, a vast, circular chamber carved from a single piece of obsidian with Theron at her side. His presence was a formidable shield, but it could not stop the daggers in the eyes of the assembled nobles. They sat on tiered stone benches, their faces elegant, beautiful, and utterly merciless. Their whispered comments were like the rustle of dry leaves, just loud enough for her to hear, so small, smells of mortal decay. Look at her hands, rough as a labourer's. Lord Valerius, his face a mask of cold fury, sat directly opposite the thrones, his obsidian eyes fixed on her as if she were a blight upon the very stone he sat on. Every breath she took felt like an intrusion, every beat of her human heart a vulgar disruption to their ancient, silent world. The humiliations, when it came, was as sharp and clean as a shard of glass. Lord Valerius rose, his voice smooth and venomous. "My king," he began, his gaze never leaving Ilara, "while we appreciate your desperate measures to address the withering, one must question the vessel. The prophecies speak of a bloodline of power, yet we see before us a creature of Dusthaven, a gutter scrounger. How can we be certain this human carries the spark of our salvation and not merely the filth of her city? What proof do we have that she is anything more than a common stray you've draped in royal silks?" The words struck Ilara with physical force, each one a stone hurled at the fragile walls she had built around her heart. The old wound, the deep-seated belief that she was worthless and unwanted, tore open, raw and bleeding in the cold, silent hall. Before Ilara could even flinch, before the tears of shame could form in her eyes, Theron was on his feet. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop by 20 degrees. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the chilling authority of a glacier grinding stone. "Lord Valerius," he said, his silver eyes blazing with a cold, contained fury, "you forget yourself. You are not addressing a creature. You are addressing Ilara, your queen." He took a step forward, his power radiating in palpable waves. "Her proof of lineage is the very reason I stand before you with a solution, while you offer only dissent and despair. Her worth is not for you to question, it is for you to honor. Should anyone in this hall, now or ever, show her anything less than the absolute respect her station demands, they will answer to me directly." He did not look at the council, he looked at Valerius, a silent promise of annihilation in his gaze. Later, in the privacy of their chambers, the silence was thick with unspoken words. The echo of Theron's defense of her hung between them, a shield and a bridge. Ilara stood by the balcony, her arms wrapped around herself, still trembling from the ordeal. She felt his presence behind her, a warm, solid weight in the vast emptiness of the room. He did not speak, did not touch her. Yet she was more aware of him than she had ever been of another living being. She wanted to thank him, to ask him why he had defended her with such ferocity, but the words caught in her throat. It was more than a king protecting an asset. She had seen it in his eyes. He had defended her. In that moment, the lines of their contract blurred into something terrifyingly personal. A bond forged not just in magic, but in the shared fire of that public confrontation. The incident shifted the dynamics of the court. The open hostility was replaced by a wary, resentful obedience, but the plotting in the shadows only intensified. At a formal banquet a week later, a young, ambitious noble from a lesser house approached Ilara with a practiced, charming smile, offering her a glass of shimmering wine and complimenting her gown. He leaned in close, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. Ilara, unaccustomed to such attention, was flustered. From across the hall, she felt Theron's gaze. It was sharp and possessive. In an instant, he was at her side, his hand resting on the small of her back, a gesture of ownership that was both a comfort and a cage. "My queen is not accustomed to the tedious flattery of our court," Theron said to the young noble, his voice a silken threat. The elf paled and bowed hastily, melting back into the crowd. That night, as Ilara lay in the darkness, sleep was a distant shore she could not reach. His defense in the council hall, his possessive touch at the banquet, these moments replayed in her mind, a confusing and intoxicating loop. He treated her with a cold formality in public, yet these fierce, protective instincts kept breaking through his control. He was a king securing his investment, she told herself. It was all part of the pact. But her heart, a foolish, stubborn organ that had survived starvation and despair, refused to believe it. It whispered a dangerous question into the silence of the room, a question that terrified her more than any elven noble. Are we just pretending? The thought was a crack of lightning, illuminating the perilous truth that her feelings for the cold elf king were becoming devastatingly, irrevocably real. In another part of the castle, Theron stood on a high balcony, the cold night air doing nothing to cool the strange fire in his veins. He had brought her here as a means to an end, a living key to unlock his people's salvation. He had expected to feel duty, perhaps even a grudging respect for her resilience. He had not expected this. He had not expected the jolt of primal rage he felt when Valerius insulted her, a fury that went far beyond a king's wounded pride. He had not anticipated the possessive, irrational jealousy that had seized him when that young fool had dared to touch her. She was a human, a fragile, short-lived creature, yet she was awakening parts of him he thought had turned to stone centuries ago. She was a complication he could not afford, a vulnerability his enemies would exploit. And yet, the thought of a world without her in it was becoming an unbearable silence. The fragile, unspoken truce between them was shattered when Lord Valerius, ever the strategist, changed his line of attack. He requested a private audience with the king, his demeanor one of feigned humility and concern. He no longer questioned her worthiness, but the efficacy of their union. "My king," he purred, his eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction, "the court is appeased by your show of strength. They accept the human queen, but their acceptance, and the magic of this pact, is predicated on one thing: the renewal of the bloodline. The withering does not wait for courtship. The people grow restless. They ask when they might expect the promise of a future. They ask when we might expect an heir." The word, spoken aloud, was a weapon, designed to strip away the burgeoning emotion between Theron and Ilara and reduce their relationship back to its grim, biological imperative. Theron found her in the moonlit garden, tracing the patterns on a crystalline flower. The quiet peace she had found there vanished the moment she saw the expression on his face. The warmth that had begun to flicker between them was gone, replaced by the cold mask of the monarch. He looked like a man about to pronounce a death sentence. He stood before her, the moonlight casting his features in sharp, unforgiving lines of silver and shadow. "Ilara," he began, his voice devoid of all emotion, a carefully constructed wall of regal distance. "The council grows impatient. Lord Valerius has made it clear that my public defense of you is not enough. They demand the final fulfillment of our pact. They are demanding an heir." His words dropped into the silent garden like stones into a still pool, and the dangerous, beautiful illusion of their growing bond shattered into 1,000 pieces. The words struck her like a physical blow, colder and sharper than any Dusthaven winter. An heir. The clinical, final term stripped away every fragile hope she had dared to nurture. She was back to being a vessel, a biological solution, a womb to be filled for the good of the kingdom. The warmth she had felt in his defense, the tentative connection in the library, the possessive fire in his eyes, it all curdled into a cruel, calculated lie. She took a step back from him, wrapping her arms around herself as if to ward off the sudden, soul-deep chill that emanated from him. "So that's all it was," she whispered, her voice cracking with a pain so profound it felt like her bones were breaking. "Your grand defense in the council hall. It wasn't for me. It was to protect your investment, to ensure the broodmare was kept in pristine condition before being put to use. How foolish of me to think otherwise." Theron's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along the sharp line of his face. Her accusation was a dagger, and it found its mark because it was laced with a truth he could not deny. He wanted to reach for her, to shatter the icy wall of duty that stood between them, but his hands remained clenched at his sides. "You think I enjoy this," he countered, his voice a low, dangerous rumble of suppressed emotion. "That I enjoy being hounded by my own council like a debtor. This is not merely about their impatience, Ilara. It is about a prophecy, a final thread of hope that is about to snap." He took a step towards her, his silver eyes blazing with a desperate, haunted light. "The ancient texts are clear. If an heir of the renewed pact is not conceived before the rise of the twin moons, the withering will become irreversible. The last spark of our magic will be extinguished forever. We have less than a month." The revelation of a deadline did not lessen the blow. It made it infinitely worse. A month. Her life. Her body. Their future. All reduced to a grim, celestial timetable. It was no longer a pact. It was a sentence. A cold horror washed over her, making her feel small and utterly powerless. A pawn in a cosmic game she had never agreed to play. "A prophecy," she repeated, the word tasting like poison. "So I am not just a cure, but a sacrifice to be offered up before your moons abandon you? Tell me, Theron, was any of it real? The moments in the library? The way you looked at me? Or was it all part of the king's strategy to gentle the mare before leading her to the stud? Was I meant to fall for you, to make the duty more palatable?" Her questions were not just born of anger, but of a deep, tearing grief for the man she had started to believe he was. His control finally shattered. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his presence so overwhelming that the air crackled around him. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a physical force, a storm of raw, conflicting emotions. "You dare ask if it was real?" he snarled, his voice raw with a pain that mirrored her own. "You think this is what I wanted? To bind a woman of fire and spirit to a dying world and a cold throne? Every moment I spend with you is a torment, Ilara, because you remind me of everything my people have lost and everything I can never truly have. You are not a cure. You are the wound, the constant, aching reminder of a life I might have known, a heart I might have had, if I were not a king but merely a man." The confession was not one of love, but of an agony so deep it was indistinguishable from it. His words hung in the charged silence of the garden, a raw and bleeding truth that left them both breathless. The anger in Ilara's heart did not vanish, but it was eclipsed by a wave of profound, devastating empathy. She saw him then, truly saw him for the first time, not the cold monarch or the desperate strategist, but a man imprisoned by his own crown, as trapped by this prophecy as she was. His torment was as real as her own. The vast chasm of their different worlds collapsed into a single, shared point of exquisite pain. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out and her fingers brushed against the back of his hand. The contact was electric, a silent acknowledgement of their shared fate. They were not king and vessel. They were 2 souls standing on the edge of an abyss, bound together by a magic that promised to either save them or destroy them completely. Their fragile, silent truce was broken by the sharp, formal cry of a royal herald from the palace balcony. "His Majesty King Theron and Her Majesty Queen Ilara are summoned to the Hall of Echoes. The High Council is convened and awaits your presence." The voice echoed through the crystalline garden. a brutal intrusion of their political reality. Theron's face hardened instantly, the mask of the unassailable monarch snapping back into place, but his eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a silent, desperate plea. The time for secrets and unspoken feelings was over. They had to face the vipers of his court now, with their hearts exposed and the weight of the prophecy pressing down on them. He offered her his arm, a gesture of grim formality, and together they walked from the garden, two sovereigns marching towards a throne that had become their shared scaffold. They entered the Hall of Echoes not as king and consort, but as two soldiers walking into their final battle. The obsidian walls seemed to drink the light, reflecting the cold, merciless faces of the elven High Council. Lord Valerius stood before the twin thrones, his posture radiating triumphant malice. He did not wait for them to be seated. "King Theron," he announced, his voice ringing with false piety, "we have waited, and the twin moons are upon us. Yet the withering deepens, the human has failed. We believe this prophecy was a lie, a desperate gambit to justify polluting our court with a mortal blight. I, Lord Valerius of the Obsidian Spire, with the support of the noble houses, demand you set this human aside and abdicate your throne. Your reign has brought us nothing but false hope and this final disgrace." Every word was a stone, and Elara felt the weight of them all, a public execution of her worth. Before Theron could unleash the glacial fury building in his eyes, Elara stepped forward, breaking from his grasp. A hush fell over the hall. She was not dressed in opulent silks, but a simple gown the color of the Dusthaven sky, a silent reminder of who she was. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a queen's command, but clear and steady, forged in the fires of starvation and solitude. "You speak of blights and prophecies," she began, her gaze sweeping over the council, "but you are blind to the true sickness that afflicts you. You are not dying because your magic is fading. You are dying because your hearts have turned to stone. You have forgotten how to hope, how to fight, how to feel." She turned her eyes to Theron, and the entire world narrowed to him. "I came to this kingdom as part of a bargain, a tool to be used, but I saw behind the crown. I saw a man carrying the sorrow of 1,000 years on his shoulders, alone. I did not fall in love with a king, I fell in love with him." The confession, so raw and human, shattered the icy stillness of the hall. Theron's composure broke, his carefully constructed mask of kingship crumbling to dust. He moved to her side, his eyes locked on hers, seeing nothing and no one else. "She is right," he declared, his voice resonating not with royal authority, but with the profound, earth-shaking power of absolute truth. "I was a fool. I sought a cure in ancient texts and bloodlines, believing magic could be forced like a key in a lock. I saw her as a means to an end, a vessel for our salvation." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, a public act of intimacy that was more shocking than any abdication. But the prophecy was never about an heir. It was about a heart. It was about reminding a dying race what it means to live. "Elara is not the key to our magic. She is the key to mine, and I would let Silverwood turn to dust before I let her go." As his words echoed in the hall, a miracle occurred. A soft, golden light began to pulse from the very center of the floor, where the ancient heartstone of the kingdom lay dormant. It was not the cold, silver light of elven magic, but something warmer, wilder, more alive. The light flowed outwards, not from the stone, but from where Theron and Elara's hands were joined. It was the magic of their bond, the fusion of his ancient sorrowful power and her fierce human resilience. The prophecy was not about a child, it was about the union itself. A love so profound it could bridge two worlds and reawaken a sleeping land. The withering was not a plague upon their magic, but a reflection of their despair, and in that moment hope was reborn. Lord Valerius stared, his face a mask of disbelief, as the obsidian walls around them began to shimmer with a renewed, living light. Theron turned Ilara to face him, oblivious to the gasps of the council and the golden light bathing them in its warmth. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the universe. The weight of centuries seemed to fall from his shoulders, leaving only the man, raw and vulnerable and utterly besotted. "You were never a bargain," he whispered, his voice thick with 1,000 years of unshed tears. "You were a destiny I was too blind to see." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a kiss of utter surrender and absolute possession, a silent vow that transcended oaths and crowns. It was the sealing of two souls, and as their lips met, the golden light exploded outwards, a wave of life that surged through the castle and into the silent forest beyond, coaxing the ancient trees to finally, after a century of silence, begin to sing again. 1 year later, the forest of Silverwood was no longer silent. The trees hummed with vibrant life, their silver bark gleaming under a sun that felt warmer than it had in generations. In the heart of the royal garden, Queen Ilara sat beneath a singing willow, a book resting unread in her lap. King Theron knelt before her, his head resting against her gently rounded stomach, his eyes closed as he listened to the two heartbeats within. He was not a king burdened by a dying world, but a man at peace, anchored to his home, to his future. They had been forged in the cold crucible of desperation, a human stray and an elven king bound by a pact. But they had discovered a truth more powerful than any prophecy. They were not two separate beings from different worlds, but two halves of a single soul, destined to find their way home to each other. Theirs was a love that had not just saved a kingdom, but had built a new one. If their story has moved you, please show your support by liking this video, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel for more tales of love against all odds.